Okay, so what's the difference between mental health issues and mental health disorders, right? I want to answer this question because a lot of times people have a meltdown, let's say, and they say, oh, I think I have generalized anxiety disorder, or they watch TikTok and they say, I think I have ADHD, so what is the cutoff between having mental health issues and what is the diagnosable clinical symptoms of mental health disorder, okay? So this is a diagram called normal bell curve, and this is used in a lot of medicine, but also economics, but it basically is a curve that represents a population. If you think the population is big enough, everybody will fit under that curve somewhere, okay? So I'm going to use a high blood pressure for an example because that's a very common medical condition that we're all familiar with. So when we're diagnosing high blood pressure, in that normal curve, we draw a line. It's kind of arbitrary, but based on evidence that if you're left of the curve, then you don't have high blood pressure, but if you're right of the curve, you do, okay? So based on evidence, we say the stage 1 hypertension, systolic is 130 to 139, and diastolic is 80 to 89. Everybody kind of familiar with that? Yeah. So it's just a number, it's a range, and it kind of draws a line in the sand, and it defines a diagnosis and not. And then there's stage 2 hypertension, where there's a higher number, right? And how we, in medical research, how we reach these numbers is based on a lot of factors that we might not consider all the time. So drawing the line, we have to calculate what's the risk of diagnosing, right? And leading to unnecessary treatments, and what is the risk of not diagnosing and leading to consequence of untreated hypertension. Okay, so those are the things that we have to balance when you are drawing the line in the sand. And another thing that we have to look at is like public health burdens. So if we draw the line in the sand and a lot of people need blood pressure medication, can the nation afford that? So there's a lot of kind of economical and material, kind of concerns when we're drawing the line in the sand. And public health burden, access to care, this is all kind of under the access of care, the materialistic economic factors. Quality of care, stigma, destigmatization, and specificity, which is like if we draw the line in the sand, how much of the people who qualify really have hypertension? Do you guys kind of get that? Right? So it's like when you're kind of like scooping up the sand, how much is our real hypertension, right? And not the ones who had a really bad hypertension day a few times, right? Like what is the cutoff? And sensitivity is how much of that will be, how much of the people who fall away really don't have it. So these are the public health, epidemiology terms that we have to consider when we're drawing the line in the sand. So it kind of seems a little bit not clinical. There's a lot of external factors that we have to do. We have to consider all these different things to draw the line in the sand. So let's look at ADHD. Right? It's a mental health disorder. We don't really have numbers for ADHD, right? So how do we draw the line in the sand for mental health disorders? So everybody's under the curve, but we do draw the line based on evidence as much as possible, and we use the big, thick book of DSM-5, okay? And every time there's a new edition. And they have different criteria, like 7 out of 9 impulsive, symptoms, 7 out of 9 hyperactivity symptoms. So we try to quantify as much as possible to make that cut. Depending on the severity, so remember how there was like a stage 1 hypertension and stage 2. So in the diagnosis, we draw the line in the sand as much as possible, as accurate as possible, but just because you have ADHD tendencies doesn't mean that you need medications. There's also therapy options, there's different treatment options. But if you look like, let's say stage 2 ADHD, that's when we would recommend medication. So just because you have the diagnosis doesn't mean automatic I have to be on medication, okay? And how we differentiate from stage 1 and stage 2 is we have to look at over a long period of time and the burden of the mental health issues in you being, a father, mother, son, daughter, right, civil citizen, paying bills on time, all these things will kind of play a factor to divide the criteria. Now, one point that I wanted to mention in this slide is, imagine if you had a patient who's consistently 129 over 79, right? Do they have hypertension? No, not based on this criteria. But are they, just because they don't have hypertension criteria, are they that much healthier than the person who is 130 over 80? No. So the reason why I wanted to show that is we draw a line because we have to, but it's all a spectrum. Do you see kind of what I'm saying? So a lot of times people, and this is how I want to destigmatize mental health, is just because you have the diagnosis doesn't mean that you're that much sicker. It's all a spectrum, it's the shades of gray. So you might fall somewhere and you might meet the criteria for diagnosis, but that doesn't mean that you're less than, All right, so this is the last component. So what does God think about mental health? So this was not in his plan. So mental health, I think, is just like any other illness that's medical. We all believe that medical illness is due to sin entering the world, right? And then it kind of has a ricochet of effects. I think mental health is exactly the same. I don't think it was his intention to create mental health in his original design. But I believe that his response to mental health is drastically different from how church has answered mental health. So if you look at the Bible, there's so many examples of prophets and people who are after God really expressing their mental and emotional burden, right? There's Elijah who was suicidal, there's Jonah who's angry, there's David who's depressed and anxious, and also Moses has a social anxiety disorder. He had a public speaking anxiety, right? And even with God pleading like, you need to go, I think Moses fought with God like 4 or 5 times, right? He's like, I don't think I'm the right person, right?
Speech is impaired.
Yes. So there's so many examples of this, and I think you guys know, if you know the Bible, there's so many examples of real life mental health crisis in the Bible, right? But he hears it, and I think a lot of people with mental health illness comes to me, and they might have Christian background, or their parents might be culturally not as accepting as other cultures, and they will say things like, no, you don't. You're not depressed. You're not anxious. Just get over it, right? This will pass, right? But how God answers these prophets and his children are eye-opening. So he answers you. He doesn't just hear you, but he answers you. And sometimes he answers angrily, but he still answers you, right? He's there with you. And this is something that I didn't personally see in my personal life growing up. And I always perceived that God was like, just do it. Just get over it and figure it out and I'll do it. But the more that I get to know God, he answers, So in a way, Jonah is complaining, but he doesn't answer like, how dare you? Do you know who I am? Right? He's like, do you think it's right for you to get angry? Like, how's that serving you? It's a very understanding tone. And when Elijah was suicidal and depressed and all burnt out, he didn't say, get over it. You're my prophet. You're going to do my job, right? He sent the angel to make him sleep and eat and nourish his body. He took care of Elijah. And David, we know the Psalms of, the help comes from God, and whenever I plead for him, he listens, and he always ends up in praise. And this is a relationship that God offered to anyone who's willing to come to him. And Moses, this is an interesting one, that Moses was not willing to do what God wanted him to do, and God knew that Moses was the guy to do, right? But he angrily responded, okay, I'll get you help. right? He didn't say, get over it, you're still the man. He said, I'll get you the help that you need. If anxiety is that overwhelming, I will provide a helper for you, right? He never makes us do things just because or by ourselves. So the reason why I think God responds and God's able to respond this tenderly to our mental health and emotional struggles is because he knows it is bigger than you. And this is a timeline, a very simple drawing that I did. And if this is a timeline of the world, the smiley face is where we are, okay? And the sun represents the creation of the world, okay, when the creation started. And this triangle is the effect of sin in our world. So imagine the smiley face is me, and let's say that I got bullied, or I have trauma or relationship trauma. I know that that person was hurt and abused, probably, right, before. And so imagine I'm at the smiley face, I'm going up, right? The previous generation had trauma, and the previous generation had trauma. It all starts from how sin entered the world and created this brokenness, right? And it's a chain reaction, but also that triangle shows you that the effect of sin is exponential. Over time, it's gonna affect more and more people, and it's gonna multiply its effects, right? So here we are at the middle of the timeline. But what I think is Jesus came in the middle of that to show us something different. Doesn't mean that sin's gonna stop hurting us, right? Doesn't mean that we'll be completely all mentally free from illnesses in this world. The effect will continue to happen, but I think Jesus came to show us that there's something else, even in our mental health struggles. I have a thing or two about how historically church and Christians have responded to mental health, and I'm biased because I'm a psychiatrist, but this is a difference between us and God and how we see mental health. So he doesn't dismiss it, he sees the reality of it. He doesn't dismiss that if I don't see it, it doesn't happen, right? He knows and he expects it. He's not surprised by it, he expects it, right? Sin entered the world, he knows how it's gonna go down. He doesn't hide it, he reveals it. He doesn't turn, his eyes away when Elijah is suicidal. He reveals what's going on in our mind and our hearts. He doesn't judge it, he sees beyond it, right? The burnout, the suicidal thoughts. He doesn't, assess you by it. He sees you beyond your complaints. He doesn't ignore it, he's aware of it. He doesn't blame it, he blames sin. And he doesn't give up on it, he deals with it. So at the end of the day, he sees you apart from it. And this is something that I wanted to kind of share is that, if I have mental health disorder, a lot of times the stigma is my faith is not strong enough, or like I'm not believing the right stuff, and God wanted me to be free from mental health, right? But it almost like, not that he doesn't care, but he sees you apart from it. Like it's a different issue, He sees you as a person who's made in his image, who's struggling with the effects of sin in the world. He doesn't define you by it. So this is a normal bell curve that represents a whole population, and as we talked about, all of us fall somewhere in that curve. But what I think is that you're more than the place in the spectrum. Right now, you could be one end of the line of the sand, you could be on the other side, it will all change. But I think Jesus Christ died for everybody under that curve. And whoever believes in him will carry you to the other side to ultimate health. But you're more than the place in the curve. So this is just kind of like a promotion. So on the left is my podcast. So if you like the material, how I presented it, I want to teach mental health in these terms. And on the right is my private practice website. In case wherever you are in the journey, I would love to kind of help you understand, how I explained it. And I think the next slide is just a thank you slide. So that was a very short presentation, but I think you guys were kind of tracking, right? So I will open up the floor for some questions. I hope you really enjoyed the video, and if you want more information, please email me at restorepsychiatrymd@gmail.com or put a comment below, and I'll have more videos following in the future, so hit subscribe. Thank you.